diplomatic security and law enforcement career. Mike is a lead trainer and facilitator for several non-profit education organisations. Also with us today is the director of Together School, Kevin Lloyd, whose company is based focusing on improving school safety, security, as well as engaging the school community. Together School brings systems, processes and people together in one app. Kevin has been involved for over 20 years within international schools, all part of the International School Recovery Forum, and you can see the link here for further information. Please join me in welcoming and handing over to Mike and Kevin for our discussions today. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for that. Welcome everybody. We're going to actually we'll kick things off here with we're going to run some polls throughout to keep everybody a little bit busy and stuff. So we're going to launch one quick poll here as we get started. So Georgie, thank you for that. What we wanted to talk about, as you see on the screen, is international school recovery, and you know what a recovery really means for us and why it's important is it's a, you know, it's the process right now that everybody is going through, and it's quite often normally a process that you would go through after an event has occurred, the event or situation has passed, and now it's time to take steps to get back to where you were at. For what we're dealing with now, recovery is a little bit different, because recovery is going to be a process that goes for some time. And that's why we see it as important. So Mike, with that, why don't we hand over to you now to talk a little bit about the access control and the topic of the day.
Okay, thanks Kevin. So, as Kevin said, with recovery, it's part of the emergency planning management process, and access control is a key component of that. And so the emergency planning management process is 7 components, or 7 pillars, if you will, and it's meant to be a continuous process. And so even though we're going to focus on aspects of the recovery, the reason we're doing that is that typically organizations, schools would plan for everything within the emergency planning management process is a continuous throughout the year, throughout all time. And so you're constantly assessing for new threats, you're mitigating, you're preparing. And while you're doing all of this planning, you're also planning for your recovery. And I'll be the first to tell you that as someone who has taught and trained hundreds of international school leaders around the world on emergency planning management and how to prepare for disruptions and building resiliency on your campus, I, like everybody else I think in the world, was caught short and very much surprised by the magnitude of this COVID-19 pandemic. Nobody ever dreamed that at some point we would have approximately 91% of all school-age K-12 kids would be out of school at the same time because of a pandemic. So now we're all having to learn. And so my point of that is that we're in the recovery process, and we're literally having to build that as we are trying to recover from coming out of this pandemic. But I think it's important to note that everything we're doing now needs to be codified, needs to be put into your records, because next time there will be another coronavirus, and experts estimate it could be, once this one is done, it could be another one in the next 2 to 3 years. So we're going to always face this battle with coronaviruses. So schools, whatever you're learning today, you'll need to, this will be part of your continuous emergency planning management cycle to build for the future and how to respond to, and I think schools in general, society in general, will be better prepared to deal with recovery in the future. So let's delve into a little bit about access controls. What are access controls? And you can take a couple minutes and read that. Access controls are something that we do assessments at schools all around the world, and this is one of the first things we think about is you have a campus perimeter, you have a wall, you have a fence, you have gates, and so that is so that you can control everybody that comes onto your property comes onto your campus, you have to have access controls for that. And it's usually it's allowing those that have legitimate access to come onto your facility. So think about in prior to COVID-19, I think it's important to understand, we typically, when we thought about access control, and we thought about perimeter fences and gates and security guards and things, we're looking at sort of mitigating the threats that we were aware of at that time. And typically that would involve what I would call malintent, someone who wants to come on campus to commit some type of criminal activity. It could be for child protection issues, and I know every school on here today is well aware of the child protection requirements now and policies and procedures, accountability for stakeholders, child custody issues. You might have a situation where you have a non-custodial parent who is denied access to their child. So that's been the traditional reason for deploying a robust access control system to threats. So now we have to think about not only the continuous man-made or what I call man-created threats, we have to now think about the coronaviruses. The new considerations that we have to think about when we're dealing with coronaviruses. We still want to think about access controls from a multi-hazard standpoint, but everything we've done in the past, we now have the thinking has to be much more expanded. So the typical, like with the traditional access controls, who should be on campus? So now it's going to be much more particular about who should be on campus, because there's certain restrictions going to need to be at play. Certainly, when you're looking at where you are in your risk matrix for the COVID response, some schools may be, depending on where they are, they may be a little more open than others. But typically, as we see around the world, an extremely restrictive environment as they reopen. So that would mean social distancing, masks, all the various controls you're seeing based on your local or regulatory regimes and your local health compliance. So now we have to think about who should be on campus. But that's traditional for access controls. But now we have to think about where will they go on campus. It's no more of just you're going to allow this person in and go free throughout wherever they need to go. So now we're going to need to know where they go. And then why should they be on campus? What's their real reason for being there? We're in a point where we really want to limit the number of people that are on our campus. So you really have to start thinking about the why. And then of course, what's going to be very important is the when. When were they on the campus? So these are all considerations that are really magnified from what we used to think about when we had access controls.
Okay, so why this is important then for schools, for us, is really, you know, the one of the main things is obviously transparency of information. It's important that we understand and are able to share information about the situation, whether it's for tracing or for, you know, informing people if you have an experience with COVID on your campus or something like that. The transparency of information is important. We also see it as important because it's about limiting exposure. So managing the access and where people can go and things like that will help you in terms of that. And then you may have even regulatory requirements that say that there are certain things that you need to do, there's certain things you need to document, or whatever it may be that you have to support with your access control. And then a big one of this is also confidence, the confidence that you instill and provide to those who are coming to the campus, whether it's students, whether it's staff, or even parents sending their kids to your school. They want to know that you've got processes and procedures in place that help to protect the environment. So these are the reasons why we see it as important. And then in terms of where we're going to go now with this discussion today, we're going to basically focus on four things. And as we go through it, after each one, we will have a bit of an opportunity for question and answer. But we're going to be talking about the access policy, a strategy that you may have or may want to have, and things you want to consider. Managing the arrival and departure or dismissal of the students to the campus, and ultimately then managing the access on campus itself. And finally, then an important part of all of this is, once all this is in place, training, education, and community communication of what you're dealing with here. So those will be the areas we go through today. Okay, Mike, back to you.
So let's start thinking about or talking about the strategy and policies for access control. It's always going to start with a written set of policies and procedures. You can't ask your community, your stakeholders, to adhere to something if they don't know what exactly they're doing. So we see this a lot when we visit schools. They might have a loose policy, but this is a situation where there needs to be detailed information about what the policies are, what the controls are, so that the stakeholders will know what the expectations are when they arrive at campus. And so you're going to spell out who can come on, when they can come on. All this should be spelled out in your written access control policy. And then, of course, shared widely with your community of stakeholders, so there's no doubt about what the school's responsibility is when it comes to controlling access. And then the second part of that, just as important, is the enforcing the access controls. Many times you'll have policies or procedures in place, but then there certain people come in, they're allowed to go around whatever the normal procedures are. And so what's very much important is to make sure that the policies that have been set out by the administration, the school administration, are in fact enforced. And then of course that gets into who's enforcing. Typically it's the security staff, but very important that the controls are enforced. And now we have new things like temperature screening. So this is something that we would have never thought about before, but temperature screening is very much going to be part of your access control now. It's a means of denying someone access based on a set temperature reading of their body. And that temperature is typically set by local medical authorities. Here in the U.S., it's usually if you have over 100 degree temperature, you're not allowed access. But this needs to be spelled out and explain to everybody about what the parameters are for this screening. And temperature screening in itself creates a whole lot of other issues. So what are some of the screening procedures created that are vulnerabilities? So you think about what you're doing when you're doing screening. You're going to be lining people up potentially. You have to think about where everybody is queued up. I mean, you're going to be social distancing. So if you're in a school, and I've been to many schools where they're on a main street and your access to the campus is right off the main street. So you have to think about, okay, when people are being controlled in this environment, access is being extremely controlled to your campus. You cannot put others at risk while they're waiting to go through their temperature screening. Obviously, the screening process is going to take longer. So we have to think about, obviously, the safety of our stakeholders. So you don't want to put your screening process that create other issues or other vulnerabilities where you put your stakeholders at risk. Other types of strategies for controlling is, determining, sometimes they call it self-verification. You're going to screen for people who have traveled maybe out of the country, who have been exposed to others, people who are ill. So these are all things that are going to come into play as part of your access control policies for COVID-19 response. And a lot of this is built into medical pre-screening of policies and procedures. And this is where a lot of schools are deploying this for, say, for visitors or for parents. They'll do a self-declaration that essentially someone certifies or they're saying that they have not had these various issues, they haven't been exposed, they're aware of these types of things. So this is all going to be part of the pre-screening for access control. And of course, a big one is identification badges. I have been to schools around the world that do not use identification badges. It's certainly outside of the best practices. So anybody that comes on a campus should have an identification badge. That's the best means for security to control access, to know who is coming and who they are. And never more important than right now is being able to identify someone that they are in fact authorized to have access to the campus. So identification badges, ID cards, there's various means, identification media, various different ways to talk about it, but absolutely imperative that schools have a very robust ID card or ID badge system. Then of course, one of the biggest things is everything you do is going to need to be documented. And we'll get into this a little bit more about when we talk about contact tracing, but everything you do needs to be reinforced, documented, spelled out, so there's no question about what's going on and why.
Okay. Thanks for that, Mike. I think we have some time now for some questions on that. One of the things I just wanted to add also, I think in terms of the you know, your overall strategy and stuff, it's really important to be thinking about the breadth of the people who normally might have the opportunity to come onto campus. Like, you know, just as an example, if a bus driver needs to use a bathroom, what's your policy going to be to that? You know, are you going to let them in? Or when are deliveries taking place? When is cleaning staff allowed? Teachers and things like that, you know, are they allowed to come on days that they maybe don't have class? You know, there are just so many variables depending on how you're operating. So when you're thinking about this, you got to start really thinking very broad about the types of people and when and why they can come on your campus. So let's move to some questions now. I don't know if, Georgie, if we had any questions in the chat itself yet, or
no, we've not had any questions, but I'll keep it open, and then everybody, if you want to ask any specific questions to Mike or Kevin, then please feel free to pop them in there. But there's nothing at the moment, chaps.
Okay.
Kevin, you want to talk about this one of these questions?
We could, yes. So why don't we pull up the poll questions, Georgie, and see what the results are so far.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is does your school have an access control policy? So it's sort of 50-50 response here.
Okay.
And I suspect for schools that are reopening, an access control policy is probably in most places would be very much expected that you should have something in place.
Okay, I'll launch poll 2.
So one of the things about the access control policies, yes, I mean, most schools should have them. I see the poll was about 50-50. One of the important things is to make sure that whatever the current COVID-19 environment as you reopen, that access control policies are updated to include all this new information. And oftentimes the school is probably running ahead of what's actually going into their policy. So it's very important to, before your school reopens, that you update the policies to include all of the new procedures.
Okay. Sharing. Sharing the results, poll results for question 2 around visitor management controls.
I mean, visitor management, like I say, most schools are going to have some type of visitor management system in place. You know, you have to recognize obviously that is going to be more restrictive now, as Kevin mentioned earlier, about now people who traditionally would have been allowed access to campus probably won't now. The delivery men, maybe outside contracting services. So visitor management and access control becomes much more important. You literally may be restricted down to no visitors, to include parents, and maybe you're down to the only people that are allowed access are staff and students. And we have seen schools that are doing this. And again, it's based on your local threat. It's based on what the local authorities are recommending. So these are all things that you have to think about in context of the new COVID-19.
And perhaps, you know, this becomes a bit more of a broader topic too, that you have to be aware of much more in terms of not just accessing the campus, but what buildings, who are they going to see, how long they were in, making sure you check people out on time so that you have a more traceable record of where people were, when they were there, who they interacted with, and so on. So like Mike says, it depends on the requirements of where you're at. But again, this is something you've got to look at. Is the tool you've got now that you're using adequate to meet the requirements? You may have something now, but is it adequate to meet the requirements as you move forward?
Would you like me to launch the next poll?
Sure, we could do one more and then we can move on to the next section if there's no more questions from the audience.
Okay, we do have another question just while we're waiting for the poll to be completed. Zoe has said, do schools have legal recourse in requiring temperatures to enter? And that's from the US.
So, yeah, that's a good question. When you say legal recourse, I mean, typically this is dictated by local authorities, and they'll require a school or a business to do temperature testing. And then it gets down to if someone refuses to be temperature tested, then it goes back to, in the case of a school, you need to make sure that you have that in your access control policy, that if someone refuses to comply with whatever procedures you've put in place, then they can be denied access. At the end of the day, a school or business, anyone can deny access based on pre-established policies, as long as it's not discriminatory. And I think the medical community and the regulatory regimes, governments have said that you must temperature test, things like this. So you just need to make sure you have it in your policy that you will deny access to someone who has a higher temperature than whatever the defined definition is, or the definition is for that high temperature.
Okay, and I've just published the results of the third poll there around the visitor control systems policies.
Okay, so in the case of looking at, so we've got pre-approved, that's a good policy, visitor log at reception, and then no document required for one particular school. So again, think about now in terms of all these requirements. Much more detail is going to need to be gathered. One, why is a visitor here? Has it been approved? Does it meet the minimum requirements for someone who needs to come on school? Essentially, are they essential? And the analogy I would use is, schools are busy places and you have people delivering supplies and things throughout the day. Best practice would be that's restricted down to, while you're in this type of environment, that maybe you don't have the delivery people bringing supplies onto the campus grounds, and they have to offload off the campus and then provide it to an employee who then brings it back into the campus grounds. And another example would be an essential worker. If the air conditioning mechanical system fails and you need to have a contractor come in, then that would be considered an essential visitor. But visitors probably should be restricted down to not even parents. And a lot of schools are doing that. No one's coming on campus unless it's staff or students or an essential visitor.
Thank you, Mike. Got no further questions at the moment.
Okay. Let's move then to the next part of the discussion. So in terms of managing arrivals and dismissals, Mike, if you want to take that now.
Yeah. So again, so you think about the procedures for when you arrive and you're dismissed. A lot of schools, because of the social distancing that's required for the classrooms, they're going to have to stagger the arrivals. So when you're thinking about staggering the arrivals, you may have, you know, one grade or one class come in at a certain time. So you're going to have to think about managing this in terms of the flow of people coming onto the campus. And guess what? You have to space those people out. So if the students are arriving, just say your third grade class are arriving for their time slot, they need to be social distances as they come onto campus. And so you have to think about how you're going to space them. You're going to mark the grounds. Who's going to manage that? You're going to have some good procedures to make sure that, one, again, we don't want to create more threats by having them out exposed to other situations. So you have to be very cognizant of how you manage this. If it's raining, what the elements are going to be like. So it's a lot of thought has to go into managing this whole process. When you evaluate, you know, your temperature controls, one of the things that concerns me at some of the schools is, so if you're doing temperature testing, and we've all probably seen the videos of some of the schools are doing the thermal imaging as students are coming in. Well, if someone has higher than normal temperature, what's going to happen to that person? How are they going to be stopped, denied access? What's that policy? What's that procedure going to be? And you know, one of the things is they recommend best practices that you have an isolation area, but you have to think about, okay, you know, a student is a higher than normal temperature. They need to be pulled out of the line, taken to the isolation room. The very act of what they're doing also is now creating things that you need to worry about in terms of potential rumors. You know, how do you protect the privacy of that person? So all of these things have to be thought about in the context of where you have your isolation room, how you deny them access, and what happens in the case of a student. You call their parents, they come pick them up. So all these various different things. And then, you know, what's the policy for the parent? Are they allowed on campus to come and pick the kid up or the student up, or are they escorted out to the street? These are all things that you have to think about. And with the, you know, one of the big areas, if you're running buses or if you have drop off by parents, is where does that happen? And in the case of the buses, when you think about the unloading of buses, at every stop, are kids going to be temperature tested before they get on the bus? Are they going to have a self-test at home, or are the parents going to test their temperature before they get on the bus? What kind of restrictions are they going to be? How are you going to socially distance on the bus? And when they get off the buses, same thing. They've arrived at campus. How are you going to control that flow as they depart from the buses? And then, you know, a lot of considerations. I've seen various schools, you know, deploying temperature testing. Some might have security do it. Some might have other staff. Some might hire new people to do it. Whatever the case may be, if you're doing temperature testing, you need to make sure that they have proper PPE, protective equipment, that the staff are protected. They have a mask, they have gloves if necessary. They have sanitizer there, and because they are at a higher risk. And whoever's doing the testing, you want to make sure that they're not from the vulnerable population. They don't have underlying health conditions. They're not older. So all of these things, and obviously they have to make sure that they've been adequately trained about what the policy is, how to enforce it, and the various procedures for denying access. And then on the ID card systems, we saw in the poll that some people have them, and this is actually the best system for this type of environment. If you have what I call a smart card technology system, where you can you have a card reader, so everybody can go up to the reader, and they put their card on there, it reads it, and opens the gate, lets them in. That's the best system, because then you can easily program in if somebody has tested positive or is denied entry for some other reason. You can go into the system and electronically you can deny them entry into the school. This is the best system, and it's pretty much fail safe. Obviously, that's an expensive system. Not a lot of schools are going to have this, and so, but it's something you want to think about down the road if you don't. And again, if you don't have a system like that and it's manual, what's the system for identifying if someone has been diagnosed, they're denied access for whatever reason? What's your means of telling security that that person can't come in, and how they're going to verify that? You don't want to lead it to memory, so you're going to need to have some kind of list. And again, same thing applies if someone's denied access for some reason. What happens when they've been denied access? Where do they go? Do they go to an isolation room? What are the next steps? All this has to be thought about in your process.
Okay, that's only 3 bullets on the page. I think it's a very broad subjects that we're covering here. And again, one of these things where what was a normal process for things that we understood a few months ago, which was, managing the access and the arrivals and departures of kids in a normal way, and just, this controlling the entrance ways and things like that. Now there are factors that we maybe never thought we'd have to consider that we need to. So it would be quite interesting, actually, and I don't know, Georgie, if we have any questions again from the people on the call, but it certainly would be interesting to hear what are their challenges, what are their concerns in this area that we could help with.
Yeah, we don't have any questions at the moment, but we could share the poll around the single point of entry if you'd like me to do that, Kevin.
Yep, that'd be good.
It'd be interesting to know how many have a challenge around this issue.
Yeah, especially when you think, what Mike was mentioning about, and you look at the pictures and stuff about if you've got a campus where you're bringing a few hundred kids at a time in, and you're spacing and doing these things and stuff, how much time does that alone take, and how much resource and things like that? And how does that affect the school day?
So so 60% of the schools looks like they have a single point of entry. So
Mm-hmm.
This is why you have staggered arrival times and departure times. This is why you're doing a lot of the sort of the room to room, or whatever they call it, where you've got half the kids there at a particular time, because it completely is going to overwhelm your access control system. No matter what, even if you have a single point of entry or if you have multiple points, you're still going to be, it's going to be a burden on trying to manage that, not only from a staffing standpoint, but just everything else about potentially putting your stakeholders at risk for other issues as you're trying to manage access to your campus, which is, again, why we have to stagger times and arrivals and things like that.
Would you like me to share the next poll around what control access system people actually have, and they can perhaps indicate?
Yes, be great.
Just a couple more moments.
Interesting there, Mike, where there's a couple of schools indicate that they don't have gates, but they all have guards.
Right.
So I guess eventually the control would probably funnel to the doors, which then becomes more of a problem.
Yeah, so I think, I don't know where those schools are, but typically if you see a campus that doesn't have a perimeter fence or gates, then it's typically the control is right at the building entrance. And as you say, it just creates, it just lines you up that much more in terms of, and particularly if you're in an urban environment where, you're downtown in a busy area. where there's a rush to get everybody into the building as soon as possible, but you don't have the luxury of speeding it up. You have to go through the process. So it's going to make it more difficult. And not having technology, then you have to rely on the guards. And it goes back to, how well the guards trained. How are they going to know that someone has been denied access for whatever reason? They've traveled out of the country. They meet the requirements as set out in your policy about not coming to school. Another question may be if you have a staff member who might be vulnerable. I've seen schools where if just say you have a staff member who has diabetes, which is something that puts them in a very vulnerable situation with COVID-19, and the school may say, well, we don't want you coming to campus, but what if they decide to come anyway? And so what's the school going to do? And how are they going to deny that teacher or that staff member access? So it's a very complicated process, and one that schools have to think really long and hard about, in addition to everything else you're thinking about. But it starts with your access controls. But I was happy to see, by the way, that people aren't relying on the honor system.
So Zoe's also asked another question about what recommendations do you have for staggered arrival and dismissal when K-12 students ride buses together? She's heard of staggering based on grade level and thinking about holding areas.
Yeah, Kevin, you want to take a busing question?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question and very, very challenging. You can see the one image on the screen is actually about staggering or staging dismissal so that the kids aren't leaving all at the same time. So I think that's the kind of thing that you're either going to have to allocate kids to buses that are going to be based on grades and so on, but that's not going to be very efficient because you won't have optimal routes. So really the only way will be to have some kind of, like you say, holding areas, things like that, so that the kids can go on their same buses. But it's a extremely, I think, challenging one that will be interesting to see, and we'll watch that to see how schools solve that one. Yeah,
if anyone's interested, we did actually host a webinar, the ECIS webinar series from Copenhagen International School, who've actually reopened one of their primary schools. And as part of that webinar, they actually talk through sort of the entry process and how they manage that. It's available on the forum as well, so you can actually go and sort of rewatch that. That may give you some ideas and solutions as well.
And with that, Zoe, one of the things that we're going to also be doing in the coming couple of weeks, we haven't scheduled it yet, but maybe your school would like to be part of this, is we're going to host a roundtable with a handful of schools to talk about this very topic around the whole transportation and managing an efficient transportation service, keeping it safe and so on. So we're going to be doing that in the coming couple of weeks if you're interested in that. Okay, so any more questions then for this one?
No further questions at the moment.
Okay, excellent. Then we've addressed something I think is a topic that a lot of people would expect, but now we're going to, I think, move into an area that maybe is a little bit broader and a little different than maybe things we didn't think about, which is what are you doing on campus itself? So Mike?
So you think about those schools that have some type of technology at their single point of entry or at their entry points. My hope is that they would also have the same smart card technology or other technology solutions at each building. Because, one of the things that you need to think about now, in addition to the traditional means of, keeping everybody off campus that doesn't deserve to be on campus for whatever reason, now it's imperative that when someone comes on campus where they go, and to the extent possible, you want to restrict access maybe to certain buildings. I'll give you an example. Just say you're a pre-K-12 campus and you have three different sections. Obviously you have your lower school, you have your middle school, and you have your high school. And typically they may be in different buildings or different floors or whatever. So now you want to start thinking about how do you maybe restrict access. Say, for instance, you don't want elementary school commingling with middle school or high school. You don't want them passing in the same hallway. So, and how do you control that? How do you document that? You're in a situation where a lot of kids are going to be in their same classroom the whole day, and you really have to control, when students leave, when they go to the restroom, one student at a time in the restroom. How is that controlled? Stairwells. If you're a multi-story building and kids are typically going up and down stairwells, how are you going to control that? Do you have one way only? Because stairwells are typically narrow, so you want to be able to make sure that you maintain your social distancing. So, maybe it's one side of the building it's up and one side of the building it's down, and make sure you have sort of a one way, basically one way traffic. Always keeping in mind that you have to have the social distancing. So bathrooms, a lot of schools are deploying, one student in the bathroom at a time. And I think that makes sense, particularly with the younger kids. And what's that going to look like? What are going to be your staffing requirements? More teachers, assistants, more general staff to help control bathrooms. Are certain bathrooms going to be assigned to certain age groups? Obviously, if you're your primary school, particularly the younger kids, you're going to have a bathroom in your classroom, typically, pre-K and maybe kindergarten. Makes it easier. But if the students have to share a bathroom, then you have to think about how you're going to control access and monitor access to those bathrooms. And then, is it got to be certain times? I mean, kids are kids, and they don't go on schedule, so you have to be amenable to meeting their needs. Canteen. The majority of schools that I have seen, most of them are just closing their cafeteria or their canteen. You can see a picture there. I don't know where that is, Kevin, but there's one school that they've socially distanced, and the kids are eating alone because obviously they have their masks off. And so what normally would probably be a very busy cafeteria is now extremely reduced. So same thing, you think about your timing, your staging, how you get to the cafeteria, you think about the utensils. A lot of things will come into play. The food service, managing access to your canteen is going to be extremely important. And, a lot of schools are opting to, everybody brings their own lunch, you eat at your desk. These are all things and that you need to think about. But this is a big issue with canteens by the nature of located. They're typically, that's a social place, and so restricting access to this is going to have to be really, really thought out and a detailed policies and procedures written. So lockers, I know Kevin, you had a good story on this. You want to talk about this?
Yeah, I take this one. So, I mean, lockers is an interesting one because there is, depending on what your regulations are, I mean, the kids are, in some countries, are told they cannot bring things from home, so whatever they have to keep at school. So where do they keep it? I've heard that, schools are using lockers and other schools are not. So if you are using lockers, first thing is that you probably have assigned the lockers, based on a class or based, that they're grouped together. So one of the things to think about is, maybe reassigning lockers to spread them out. The second part, like I had said about bringing stuff to school and so on. We've heard one school, for example, where there is a PE bag that they recommend that the kids have, so that in that bag is everything that one particular child needs for physical education, a ball, a jumping rope, whatever other resources they might be using for physical education. However, and that's the requirement that they have that bag, but at the same time, the school may have also a requirement that they can't use their lockers. So one of the examples there that we're seeing is that, your policies need to be coordinated, between the different departments, the different requirements. You start seeing, okay, we're getting overlap and we're getting conflict with decisions that we take. So these plans, the strategy, the policy, the thinking ahead needs to really be done, tested, adapted, that's one of the things I think the key words we're really hearing from everybody is, to adapt and innovate, what it is you're doing. So that was the one on lockers, Mike.
Oh, did we cover all the polling?
Sorry, I missed you there, Mike.
The polling, Georgie, do we have any more polling?
We've got one more polling, which is around smart cards. We do have a question from Tapper Swinney. They're saying that the systems and procedures being shared are in place for the visitors in their school, but it would be interesting to see how it would all work out when we have all students, teachers and other staff expected to be in campus on a given day. So I think that, there's a reference that they haven't yet tried and tested it when everyone's back to normal.
I think that's a perfect example, of what we talked about with all of the procedures that you've got to consider and implement. If you've got to space kids out when they enter, you've got to take everybody's temperature when they enter. You've got to space out the arrivals of buses and of parents dropping or kids off or picking them up, or whatever it may be. Depending on the size of your school, we've seen schools with 50, 60 buses that they have to deal with, for example. So it will be, like you say, it will be very interesting to see how it's going to work. And that's where there'll probably have to be a lot of adaptation, perhaps technology, other solutions that may come into play there. Mike, if you got any.
One thing for sure that we're dealing with the most restrictive environment that you'll ever have in a campus. So, once we get through this COVID-19, this coronavirus, and things go back to normal, but you will still have all those things. Your safety and security is going to be better because you've learned a lot of lessons, and you'll be able to adopt things maybe to just improve your overall safety based on what you've learned through this process. And like I said earlier, I mean, the thing is that what's important is everything that you've done now is that you have it in your pandemic policy. And for the next time we have a coronavirus and you have a response, then you have it set. You literally pull it out of the cloud, and there's all the stuff that you went through and what worked and what didn't work. And I think that's the main thing. As I've seen a lot of schools are doing this sort of this staggered reopening, and they'll start maybe a couple of grades in high school, a couple of grades in middle school, and they'll experiment with it, and they'll eventually start increasing. I think it's very important not to just jump into this all speed ahead and have everybody start back at the same time. You definitely want to have a staggered plan to get everybody back in, because there's going to be a lot of bugs that have to be worked out and a lot of issues that you didn't think about that will pop up. And so you want to do that in the best control environment you can. That would mean, less students. And I think the same with buses. As Kevin said, I mean, I've been at schools where they bus a couple thousand students, 70, 80 buses. Well, now you have to run, if you don't have, you may have to run 150 buses to be able to get the social distancing on the buses. So a lot of things that considerations, and I feel for the schools, because obviously you're just trying to figure out the education piece, and now you have to figure about all this new safety and security requirements around this COVID-19. So a lot of challenges ahead, but hopefully there's resources available to you, like our forum and other things that ECIS are doing that will help you lead the way. I don't know what the pace is in terms of the schools that are on here, when they're going to reopen. But I think probably at this point, most schools will be reopening in the fall. So you'll have time to continue and do your research and do your study and figure things out.
Right.
Exactly. So
we've got a question from Gloria, who's asking, what is the spacing on buses? What's the recommendation around spacing on buses at the moment?
I think that's another one where, like I said, this is one of the ones we want to have this roundtable about in order to have this discussion about operating the buses safely and efficiently, because that's the challenge, to meet the distancing requirements on buses is difficult, because then you end up having to run 2 or 3 times as many buses, which is very, very hard to do, obviously. If your school is perhaps operating at lower capacity, then that's one way to operate the buses with better social distancing. But these are things we want to have a conversation about, Gloria, to explore and to learn what are your concerns, and also to try to find some answers for some of these things, or at least some recommendations. I'm not sure there are a lot of good answers for what we're dealing with necessarily, but recommendations. Okay, if that's it for questions, then I think let's move to really quickly to the last couple of slides, and then we can maybe, if there's any last questions before we finish. The next main point that we wanted to talk about, and this is fairly brief and fairly clear, I think, is that, you know, the access control policies and the importance of developing them is clear. I think that what Mike presented raised a lot of different areas that should be dealt with. So putting the policies in place and detailing the requirements of what you should and shouldn't do is important. But what's also even as important as that, once you have it, is the communication of those policies. The communication, not just of the policies when you've developed them, but these things are going to change and they're going to evolve. There's going to be new requirements from your local governments and things like that. And you're going to need a good way to keep people informed. So you want to make sure that you're communicating with your school community. You want to be out in front of rumors and social media and things like that, so that you're not having people coming to school saying, well, I heard this and I heard that, or whatever. Your school's policy needs to be the one that they adhere to. So communication really important there. And then on top of that, once you have the policy written and how to do it, it's really important that the stakeholders that are involved in this are trained, and that they understand it and they can enforce the policies and procedures in the right way. You know, just like thinking about who is it that denies somebody access to your campus, how they go about that process, how they protect that person's confidentiality. All of these things are considerations you need to take, and your staff needs to be well trained on those things. So then in summary, then, to kind of wrap things up, again, the importance of this whole thing is to have this robust access control, both for the man-made threats, but also now this new natural threat that we're dealing with. And like we said at the beginning, you know, it's very important that you focus on the information, making sure that information is transparent. And that's why being able to collect it and share it and use it effectively to help limit the spread, to help the school to meet the regulations that they're required to meet, and ultimately to give your school community that confidence that what you're doing is going to keep their children safe. It's going to keep the staff safe when they come back, and you know the parents are then comfortable with what you're doing as well. So with that, unless there's any more questions, Georgie, and that's the end of the presentation.
There's no more questions. I've just actually posted on the discussion board the link again for the International Schools Recovery Forum. So there is actually quite an interesting sort of article and discussions around communication plans as well with parents, which, you know, I would recommend that people read and sort of share out amongst them. It's completely free to join, and I know that if anyone is interested after this webinar, please feel free to contact the forum to find out more information about some of the roundtables that you're looking to set up at the moment, Kevin. I've also shared out again about the free webinar series. So you don't have to be a member of ECIS, but we're doing a number of sort of different webinars focusing on different areas. We've actually have one on the 4th of June coming up, which is around managing change for international schools. And again, that's in collaboration with the International School Recovery Forum. plus a series of wellbeing webinars sort of focusing on student wellbeing, teacher wellbeing, student voice, for example. So you'll see those coming up in the next few weeks and into the autumn as well. So keep checking in on those areas. I would like to really thank Mike and Kevin, and they've got their details up in front of you if you want to find out more information. It's been extremely insightful. It's prompted so many discussions and thoughts. I would recommend, again, if you haven't seen it already, to watch the webinar about reopening schools that feature Copenhagen. It all doesn't apply to every scenario, I know, but they did have some good tips and suggestions there as well. Thank you, Mike and Kevin, for giving up your time and sharing your expertise today. And as a reminder, we will also be sharing out a recording of today's webinar to everybody. So that should be with you, probably sent out tomorrow now. But I'd like to thank our guests and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.